Go ahead.
All right. Good morning, my name is Chris Cooper, and today I want to talk to you about social segregation. As students, when you walk into the union, do you notice how most people seem to be separated by their appearance, by really superficial characteristics like their skin color, where they're from, or their style of dress? And what do you think about that? This matters to me because I come from a culturally and racially diverse family, and I've experienced a lot of negative effects of social segregation and racism firsthand, as well as the benefits of multicultural relationships. And one of the reasons that I have found why many people seem to segregate themselves is that they often base the identity of themselves and other people on stereotypes. How often do we hear that this is how a white, black, gay person acts, or any person for that matter? Instead of getting to know the individual, we oftentimes like to group people into little boxes that limit our knowledge, experiences, interests, and that don't really honor people as individuals. The example that I would like to use today of some of the positive effects of multicultural relationships is rock and roll. And the reason why I chose this topic is because stereotypically rock and roll is associated with white culture, but in reality it has strong African American roots, but it was a concerted effort by individuals from both sides to help create this style of music and to make it popular. And first I'm going to talk about some of the contributions that whites have made to rock and roll, then I'll talk about some of the contributions blacks have made, and then I'm going to talk about rock and roll's impact on society. Let's begin. Recently I surveyed over 100 students randomly on campus and asked them, where did rock and roll come from or who created it? And the overwhelming #1 answer was Elvis Presley. And this is not surprising, and although it's not an incorrect answer completely, it is an incomplete one, because although Elvis did help to make rock and roll famous, he didn't create it. In the 1950s, Sam Phillips, producer and Sun Records owner, was looking for a way to bring the black sound to a white audience. And several sources say something to the effect that he is quoted as saying, if I could find a white man who had the Negro sound and the Negro feel, I could make $1 billion. Elvis's first single was recorded at Phillips Sun Records Studios and was a cover of African-American blues artist Arthur Crutiff's song, That's All Right. And because of the kind of music that it was, race music or black music, Elvis had to verify his own race on air by stating what school he went to, because callers would know that in the segregated South, blacks and whites could not attend the same school. And eventually, Elvis became known as the king of rock and roll, but even he himself never claimed to have created the musical style. Instead, he says that rock and roll has been around for many years. It used to be called rhythm and blues. There are some other notable artists early on who helped to popularize rock and roll, such as Jerry Lee Lewis, Bill Haley in his comments, and Buddy Holly, but their contribution is essentially the same as Elvis's in that they did not create the style, but they just helped to make it famous, which is an important accomplishment. Some of the artists who did help to define some of rock and roll's fundamental elements are what I'm going to talk about next. First we have Chuck Berry, who was a blues artist who transposed the two-note lead of jump blues lead piano to the electric guitar and created rock and roll's iconic lead guitar sound, which can be heard in his song Johnny Be Good. And John Lennon once said of him that if you try to give rock and roll another name, you might call it Chuck Berry. Next we have Bo Diddley, who introduced the clave rhythmic pattern to popular American music, otherwise known as the Bo Diddley beat. If you don't know what it is, it's heard in a lot of songs. The mainstay of rock music has been used by artists such as Eric Clapton, Elvis Presley, and U2, as well as many others ever since, and the roots of which can be traced back to sub-Saharan Africa and are essential to Afro-Cuban music. Last but not least, my personal favorite, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, whereas Elvis is known as the king of rock and roll, she is known as the godmother of rock and roll, even though I'm sure most of you probably have never heard of her. Her song Rock Me was the first song to be called rock and roll by critics and came out over a decade before Elvis released his first single, and Elvis even says that Sister Rosetta was a huge influence on him. A great quote I found from musician Joan Osborne said that if you listen to her recordings, you can hear all the building blocks of rock and roll. I wanted to show a clip, but I didn't have time, so I just recommend looking up some of her music sometime. The next point I want to talk about is rock and roll and social justice. The time and place that rock and roll came out of was the Jim Crow South in the 50s. And at the time, blacks and whites were legally not allowed to have any kind of meaningful relationships with one another. That is until 1954 when Brown versus the Board of Education was passed and the beginning of the repeal of segregation began to take effect. This also coincided with the release of Elvis's first single, That's Alright. And this was a time when artists were first beginning to cross racial and cultural lines much more freely. And has continued to be used as a tool for socio-political justice and change ever since. In the 1960s, many artists, including John Lennon and Yoko Ono, used rock and roll to protest the Vietnam War and to espouse love and peace instead. Rock band the MC5 were the first and only all-white rock and roll band to join the Black Panther Party and to demand equal rights for all people. And we also have artists such as Elton John, Freddie Mercury, and Rob Halford, who were some of the first openly gay musicians who helped pave the way for artists such as Sherry Wright, Frank Ocean, and Adam Lambert, so they'd be more accepted in society, or it's easier for them to be accepted in music scenes. And today we also have organizations such as Rock the Vote and Rock for Darfur that are examples of how the culture of rock and roll is still something that promotes positive change in the world. In closing, I hope you understand that there is a lot of value in embracing and celebrating people's differences and by not remaining separate from people. Rock and roll is simply one example of this, but it did help to unite blacks and whites in America, but it didn't end there. And it's continued to be used as a tool of socio-political change ever since. And I feel like it's important for us to remember that as students being here, we have the rare opportunity to be exposed to many different cultures, peoples, and ideas, and by learning and letting that affect us can really be a positive thing, but what we do with that opportunity that we have is ultimately up to us. Thank you.